When I was a kid, I must have spent every Saturday night sitting behind the TV with a Nintendo 64 controller clutched in my hand. Left hand on the middle grip and right hand on the right, obviously. Nobody uses those arrow keys on the left anyway. Ocarina of Time, Donkey Kong 64, Super Mario 64, Banjo-Kazooie, GoldenEye, countless iconic gaming classics were released on the Nintendo 64. Now, I didn't realize it at the time, but the Nintendo 64 was the first gaming console to feature 3D graphics. Looking at them now, they don't seem that impressive, but 7-year-old me was absolutely blown away by those polygons. So, where did this all start? What is the history of Nintendo? In this video, I'll take us on a trip through history to find out how Nintendo became such a giant in the video gaming industry. From the iconic Nintendo-owned franchise like Super Mario, to the adventures of Metroid Prime or the enormous success of Pokemon, it is undeniable that Nintendo has attributed to an impressive legacy of gaming classics. The Japanese firm has also successfully introduced many consoles on the Western markets from the 80s up until today. These consoles were each revolutionary in their own way. The Nintendo 64 first brought 3D graphics to the general gaming audience. And then the Nintendo Wii distinguished itself from its competitors by using its motion tracking technology through the Wiimote. And then the Nintendo Switch makes it easy to play console games on the go. And then there are the handheld gaming successes, like the Game Boy Color, the Nintendo DS, etc. If you were a kid in 2002 and you didn't have one of these, you weren't cool. Besides this, Nintendo also had many other franchise successes, most notably the Super Mario and the Pokemon franchises. But there are many others. Nintendo distinguishes itself from its competitors, like Xbox or PlayStation, by gearing towards more family-friendly content. This was a smart move. After all, the children of the 80s and 90s turned out to become avid gamers and loyal customers. But how did Nintendo become such a giant in the gaming industry? Well, it turns out Nintendo has its roots in history. Nintendo was founded as a company all the way back in 1889. That's about the same time the Eiffel Tower had its grand opening. The Nintendo company was founded as Yamauchi Nintendo, as a manufacturer of playing cards called Hanafuda that were popular in Japan at the time. The cards were used for regular pastime activities, but also for gambling. In 1959, Nintendo struck a deal with Disney to incorporate some of their characters on their playing cards. In this year, they began selling the card sets that included a booklet that explained the different games you can play using these cards. This move was a great success, selling the set to about 600,000 Japanese households in 1959 alone. This financial success made the company go public on the Osaka Stock Exchange. In the 60s and 70s, Nintendo focused mainly on producing toys for children. It was difficult to survive on this market, however. Children's toys don't usually have a long life cycle, and the market was quite saturated. Competition was fierce. The first blockbuster success that Nintendo had in this era was an accidental discovery by one of their executives who noticed one of the maintenance workers at the factory had made a mechanical arm that extended greatly. The factory worker by the name of Gunpei Yokoi was asked by the executives at Nintendo to develop his invention to be sold at the Christmas sales rush. The product was named Ultra Hand, and it was an enormous success. It sold over 1 million times. In the early 70s, Nintendo started experimenting with electronic devices that can be paired with a television. Nintendo collaborated with Magnavox Company to produce and develop optoelectronic guns for the first console in history. Development soon began of some notable titles for the arcade game industry: Donkey Kong and Radar Scope, which is a Space Invaders-esque game. Donkey Kong was the brainchild of Shigeru Miyamoto, one of Nintendo's most famous game developers who worked on countless iconic titles. In the early 80s, more titles were produced for the arcade markets. They also produced their first home console system called Famicom, short for Family Computer. The device sold over 500,000 times in Japan alone, but it faced some technical issues that forced Nintendo to call back the product from their customers. In 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System was released. It was an improved version of the Famicom. As a part of the rebranding effort, the NES came with a plug-in attachment known as the ROB, which is now a Mario Kart character. After some market testing in 1985, in some areas in the US, the NES became available to the entire US in 1986. And in that same year, two iconic titles were released as well: Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda. This move outperformed their competitors at the time by far. Nintendo had permanently secured their place in the American video game market. In fact, the NES was so successful that production didn't stop until 1995. Later, in 1989, the Game Boy was released. The handheld game device featured a slot for different game cartridges. The Game Boy was sold including one famous game called Tetris. During the late 80s, competition with other game developers ramped up again. In 1989, Nintendo released a modified version of the Famicom and renamed it the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES. It featured improved graphics and a bunch of iconic titles, such as Super Mario World and SimCity. The SNES sold over 46 million times in less than 2 years. In the early 90s, Nintendo started developing a 64-bit gaming console called Project Reality. During this time, they also released the Virtual Boy, a 32-bit game that played on a device that you can mount on your head. It can be argued that this was one of the first VR headsets, though the product didn't sell enough and it was eventually discontinued. Meanwhile, the 64-bit gaming console project was nearly finished. Project Reality was renamed Ultra 64, but Nintendo soon realized that one of their competitors, Konami, already owned the rights to the Ultra moniker. So Nintendo rebranded the console to Nintendo 64, which was released in June 1996. The release was an enormous success. The 64-bit software architecture made the Nintendo 64 the fastest console gaming device on the market at the time. It was also the first console to feature 3D graphics, which attributed to a lot of its popularity. The 3D graphics provided a whole new dimension for developers to utilize. It resulted in the development of many gaming classics, such as 007 GoldenEye. The game was developed by a team of newbie game designers from Rare. The first-person shooter was an instant classic. Zelda: Ocarina of Time was the first 3D Zelda game, and is now considered by many to be one of the greats. The revolutionary 3D technology, combined with the release of some instant classic games, guaranteed Nintendo's top position in the game industry for years. In 2001, the Nintendo GameCube was released first in Japan and later in Western markets as well. It featured a mini DVD disc drive meant for games exclusively. Despite its lack of features other than improved graphics, the GameCube was a financial success for Nintendo. The controller in particular received great reviews. After the very successful release of the Nintendo DS in 2004, Nintendo released a brand new console game device, the Nintendo Wii. The release dates for different markets worldwide were all in late 2006, right in time for Christmas sales. The Nintendo Wii was distinctly different from the competing Xbox and PlayStation consoles in two important ways. Firstly, the Wii featured wireless controllers using motion tracking technology. It offered a different way of playing games, much like how 3D graphics introduced new game design possibilities for the Nintendo 64. Secondly, the Wii and its advertising also focused much more on family-friendly content, securing a new audience in the video game industry. In 2011, Nintendo released the 3DS handheld game device. It was the first of its kind to feature stereoscopic 3D technology, which made it a successful device. The same thing could not be said for the release of the Wii's successor, the Nintendo Wii U. It featured a gamepad controller, But besides that, the console didn't sell as much as expected, and the Wii U was discontinued in 2017. The Nintendo Switch is the latest console released by Nintendo. It was released in early 2017. This console is quite unique due to the fact that it can be played on your TV in the dock station, but also as a handheld game device. The hybrid console provided a new gameplay experience for people to enjoy. The Legend of Zelda, Breath of the Wild and Super Mario Odyssey were also released in the same year. Both games are critically acclaimed and contributed much to the sales numbers of the Nintendo Switch. Now that we have a solid picture of the history of Nintendo, the logical question to ask is, what's next? Although Nintendo has not officially announced a next generation console, there are plenty of rumors, but there are no designs for this Nintendo console yet. If history is any indicator, Nintendo is sure to surprise us with an innovative and new console.